Okay. Just wanted to revamp or revisit the TJump Nephilim-free discussion. A lot of things that people don't seem to remember is that we do have historical records. We do have historical records that go back, 5,000 years or less or so. We have all the records, we have all the genealogies, we know who the people are. They're Sumerians, Hindus, Chinese, Egyptian, and that's it. That's all the history that we have. And we have a history of the global flood. Of course, we have the Y chromosomes of the three sons of Noah. We have the mtDNA haplogroups of the wives of the three sons of Noah. Everybody's present and accounted for. There's nobody extra, there's nobody missing. The Neanderthal Y chromosome is extinct. The connection to Neanderthals by way of mtDNA is way back in time, probably before the global flood. So everything is present and accounted for. We have a known history, and it goes back 5,000 years, with the exception of biblical narrative, biblical records, and other books that corroborate the historical narrative of the Bible. They say the same thing. Basically, the book of Enoch, the book of Jasher, have the same people, same history in the books from before the flood. And they're interesting reads, but what do the skeptics have? What does TJump have? What do atheists have? They don't have anything. All they have is their opinion of what they want to be true. They don't have anything. They don't have any historical records. They don't have genealogies. All they have is their opinion. And they want to point to the geology as their evidence when geology disproves their evidence, because you can't have millions of years between water deposited sediment layers. They got hundreds of millions of years between sediment layers. 100 million years is enough to wash all of the sediment layers into the ocean. More than enough, twice. It'll wash twice the amount of sediment layers into the ocean at the current rate of erosion, and which would be replaced by igneous rock. There wouldn't be any global flood sediment layers in 100 million years, or even 50 million years. So not only do they not have evidence, all the evidence is against them, because all of the layers from the Great Unconformity on up were deposited by the same catastrophic event called the global flood. It's known history. It's known human history. It's not a mystery. It's not questionable. It's known human history. And geology proves all of the ancient civilizations are built on top of the sediments deposited by the global flood. Egypt built its civilization on top of the sediments deposited by the global flood. The Sphinx consists of sediments deposited by the global flood. So what do they have? they don't have anything. They don't have any supporting evidence for their hundreds of millions of years between water deposited sediment layers, deposited in one catastrophic event called the global flood that destroyed the earth. And everything is buried in those layers. Everything living at the time is buried in those layers. So they don't have any evidence whatsoever. They don't have anything. All they have is their imagination. All they have is their unbelief of the facts. Unbelief of their own geology, their own history, their own family tree, and the only history that we have, they reject. So dinosaurs were living at the time of the global flood because they're buried in those sediment layers with all the rest of the land animals and marine life and plant life, insect life. Everything was buried in those sediment layers deposited by the global flood that are layers over a mile deep everywhere around the world. Now, do you think they even care what the volume of the sediment layers is? Do they know what the volume is of the sediment layers around the world? No, they don't care. They don't know. They don't care because they don't want to look at the evidence that disproves their belief in millions of years between water-deposited sediment layers, which is absurd, ludicrous, anti-science nonsense. They hate science. They hate the truth. Their only argument is that the Grand Canyon wouldn't have eroded in a meandering way. That's their only argument. That's the only argument they have, which is not even true because it did erode in a meandering way after the sediments were deposited. Of course it's going to meander. Streams and rivers always meander. It's not a problem. Now, if there's a lot of water going through there, it's going to cut deep, and its soft sediment layers is going to erode a lot of material. It's a global catastrophe. It's the runoff from all the water off the continent through the Grand Canyon. What do you expect? It's not complicated. It's very simple to understand. And they refuse to accept the facts. Not to mention, not even considering the fact that organisms are directed to be what they are. Humans are directed to be humans. Chimps are directed to be chimps. Everything has its own instruction to be what it is, and it can't be anything else. You can't get written instruction to be anything else that's not there. It doesn't happen. It never happens. And if you want to appeal to infinite possibilities for each and every living organism that ever existed in plant and microbe and insect life, you're believing in magic. You're believing in infinite possibilities in limited time and distance, which is not the realm of time and chance. Time and chance overtake them all. If you read the Bible, time and chance overtakes them all. It's not to the strong, not to the swift, not to the brave. There is no such thing as natural selecting the best organism. That doesn't exist. It's a figment of their imagination. Even if it did exist, it still wouldn't write instruction that's not there. because you can't even get one complementary beneficial mistake, not to mention 2 or 3 or 4 or millions or billions of complementary mistakes, which is what evolution requires. Total absurd nonsense, and they refuse to look at the evidence staring them in the face of their maker God. They refuse to even recognize that all power comes from a greater power. Everything we see requires power, requires energy. I was listening to Sean Carroll. He was saying, "Oh, you don't need energy to make the universe. All you do is expand it. You expand it. It starts out real hot. You know, he wasn't there. He doesn't know how hot it was." He says, all you do is start out real hot, expand it, and it's cold. Yeah, but where did the heat come from, you numb knucklehead? You dumb freak. Where did the heat come from? The heat had to come from somewhere. All energy comes from a greater energy. He says, oh, you don't need energy. It starts out hot and it spreads out and it cools down. Not even thinking about where the heat came from, or not even wanting to consider it. Just so much nonsense. Knucklehead scientists. And if you want to know the truth, the person I respect the most, the scientist, the secular scientist I respect the most, is Sean Carroll. And he willingly promotes global warming. He willingly promotes the idea that there's no God, contrary to what all the evidence shows. Of course, he's a nice guy. He gets along with everybody, and that's his money. That's his job. You know, he wouldn't have any of it if he disagreed with any of it. But you have these people claiming to be educated, claiming to be scientists, and they ignore where all this power is coming from. If you have infinite universes, infinite possibilities, that for every multiverse, multi-universe, there's supposed to be an infinite amount of multiverses, multi-universes according to them. Every one of them takes power. Every one of them requires power. Every atom requires power to make. Every single atom, they think it just collapses on itself, and even though they don't know how hydrogen was formed. They don't know how hydrogen supposedly coalesced and supposedly collapsed on itself when it's always spreading out. But they say it did it. And they got mathematical equations to try to prove it did. But they don't know how everything happened. You know, they just say it did. Because we're here, they say it did. But they can't account for where the heat came from. They can't account for where the energy came from. And they don't want to think about it because any little bit amount of energy, any fluctuation of a virtual particle requires a greater power. Comes from a greater energy. Comes from time and space. Result of the fabrication of matter that's already there. That's energy. And every little electron, photon, every little particle of energy comes from a greater source of energy, which comes from a greater source of energy, which comes from an infinite potential, which we can see that it takes great wisdom and understanding and knowledge and not just power to make life on earth, to make the world. And life, a world that sustains life in a hostile universe where life can take place and flourish and thrive. And the programming is not obsolete after more than 6,000 years, maybe even up to 10,000 years. The programming's not obsolete. We can't even make a cell phone that's not out of date in two years, if you're lucky. They keep coming out with the cell phone every couple of months or so, at least they used to. And each cell phone has something the other one didn't have, by intent, by purpose, by design, by a mind. Nothing happens randomly. Everything happens with intent and purpose. You can't use directed things and intent and purpose as evidence of no direction. You are the evidence of your creator. An electron, a photon, is evidence of a greater power. There is no power that does not come from the greatest power, the infinite potential. It's turtles all the way down. No, it's power all the way up. Everything is based on energy, which comes from a greater energy, which comes from an intelligence, wisdom, and understanding in order to make everything work. Science works because it was made to work. Science works because in biology it's directed. Direction never writes itself. You can't even get one or two or three copying errors to be beneficial and complementary to each other and to the rest of the genome. Because if you change one part of the genome, that's assuming that the rest of it's going to be viable and the changes are going to be complementary to the genome. And what are they, retarded? No, they just hate the truth. They can't make excuses. They just hate the truth. So their problem is they hate the truth. They hate the facts. They hate the fact that they don't have any evidence for their evolution. They hate the fact that they don't have any evidence against dinosaurs and man living together. They hate the fact you have these Babylonian mugs. You got sauropods with the necks twisted around each other. And on down through history, you have these chalices or mugs or whatever or I guess you call them steins, with these sauropods with the snake-like necks around each other all throughout history. And they're trying to say that humans don't know anything about sauropods. And the Bible said he's not afraid of flash floods. Probably not afraid of the global flood either, because That's probably how Noah knew what the depth of the water was above the highest mountain, because they were hanging out there and it was up to their shoulders. So he knew what the depth of the water was over the highest mountain just by looking at the sauropods hanging out on the highest point, because they're aquatic animals. They're not land animals, they're aquatic. So it's interesting, the Bible will say he's not afraid of flash floods. And it's interesting how Noah knew what the depth was above the highest mountain, or the highest underwater feature. I'm from the Amazon, and what you want to know is the depth of the water above the highest underwater feature. And you can't know that. You can't see that unless you have a stick. And how are you going to know where to put the stick? The sauropods are going to tell you where the highest underwater feature is, because they're hanging out there and the water is up to their shoulders. So you know exactly what the depth is. And the Bible records exactly what the depth was above the highest underwater feature. So it's just, then it describes Leviathan, the sea monster, comes out of the water, stands upright, everything runs, and it goes back into the water, churning the water, the ocean, as it goes back into the ocean. The sea, whatever. Bible talks about the Leviathan playing in the sea, in the oceans. And, it's all there. And you're going to deny the reality. You're going to deny known facts all the way through, all the way down, from today all the way back. You're going to deny your known genealogies and ancestries and historical records all the way back. The evidence is what it is. The evidence is that you have a maker and that you're going to have to answer to your maker one day. You can't get out of it. You can't get out of it. You're going to have to answer for every lie that you said, every time you ignored the facts, every time you lied to people about what the facts are. You're going to have to answer for it. There's no neutral position. Either you're on the side of truth or you're on the side of error. There's no in between. Either you're telling the truth or you're lying. There's no halfway. And that's the way it is. Everything is supernatural. Nothing is natural. Everything requires a greater power greater than itself. Nothing can make itself. Nothing can direct itself. Nothing can order itself. That is science. That is Isaac Newton's science. Isaac Newton. If you want to be a scientist, you have to be a theologian first. You have to understand what the issues are. You have to understand what the history is. You cannot be a scientist without telling the truth. You have to tell the truth if you want to be a scientist. And if you're not telling the truth, you're not a scientist, because you're not saying what is known fact. Known facts. And I hate to say it, Sean Carroll's a nice person, but he's not a scientist, because he's lying through his teeth. You have known facts all the way back. All of the evidence is on the side of creation. All of it. There is no evidence of any natural cause for anything, because nothing can make itself, nothing can direct itself, nothing can order itself. The energy does not come from itself. Scientists have to stop lying. Just face the facts, admit the truth, and stop being such a detriment to society.